Hello there everyone. Welcome back to another episode of What If Deku Was Muzan. Please subscribe and like for more videos like this. Now let's dive into the story. In all her years of being married to Masaru, Mitsuki could garner one thing from their current affairs, that being that a complete role reversal had happened. Now, it wasn't Masaru breaking up fights between Katsuki and herself, it was her breaking up fights between Masaru and Katsuki. Mitsuki also noticed, rather experienced, that Masaru was becoming more and more addicted to those shoddy cans of beer that he bought every other day. To make matters worse, she was also aware that he was overworking himself, rarely ever coming home, and when he did, it was to yell and berate her for being a failure of a mother and a wife, all the while slurring his words after getting 7 cans deep into those stupid beer cans of his. He would never share a bed with her anymore, electing to sleep on the couch. It was painful to watch her husband's decline into the drunken mess that he had become. It was like watching a train wreck. One simply couldn't look away, even if it was disturbing to know that within the wreckage lay a broken, damaged man who was once someone to be respected. But that's not where the troubles ended in the Bakugo household. Those were only the surface-level issues that everyone in the neighborhood was aware of, at least, to some degree. What went behind closed doors was a completely different affair. Even when sober, Masaru never kissed her anymore, never made love to her, and never did really anything with her anymore. He would wake up, have a cup of coffee, then walk out the door, did his job, probably did some overtime work, then came home and hurled his abusive insults toward her. He would even get into physical altercations, even sometimes using his quirk on her by slinging his acidic sweat around, resulting in small burns appearing on her skin, though by then he was already drunk and out of his mind. Yet, she never reported a thing. Not to the cops, not the local hero patrols, not to anybody. Masaru was their only source of stable income. Sure, she worked at a design agency for hero costumes, but she was only paid for the commission, and the brand she worked with was an upstart, meaning there were next to no costumers. By herself, she barely made any money at all, whatsoever. Masaru was the only one who made a stable enough living, so she allowed him to say and do whatever he wanted. It was completely out of character for her to do that. In the beginning, she fought back. But over the years, she lost her fire, lost her passion, and was completely drained because of it. She was completely submissive and often found herself crying a whole lot more than she used to. And while she lost that edge, Masaru gained it with a fierceness that she had never seen from the docile man before. There was a saying that she heard from someone on the streets before, and that saying was to be wary of the quiet ones. Oftentimes they have the most fight in them, and get really rough when it's needed. And while she heard that from a hooker teaching a newbie how it's done, those words couldn't have matched Masaru to a T more. Now more than ever. Even so, it wasn't as if she resented Masaru. Far from it. He was hurting, deeply so, and while his avenue of grieving was wrong, and it was clear he needed to see a therapist, he refused to do so. It was profoundly stupid of him, and she was pretty sure he was aware of that. But, just like she had been, he had become increasingly stubborn, though at least he was willing to admit his faults in some instances. It wasn't enough. She wanted to yell at him, to tell him to wise up and get a grip, but she knew it would only make things worse in the long run. All it would do was cause Masaru to spiral harder, and eventually do something he would regret later down the line. Mitsuki didn't want to risk that, nor did she want to risk the damage that would bring to Katsuki. Speaking of her son, there were times when Katsuki asked if she was all right. The visible pain on his face when she said that she was all right and that nothing bad was happening made her heart crack. She knew that all she would have to do was give the word, to tell him that everything wasn't all right and that Katsuki would go to the ends of the earth to snap Masaru out of it. Or, at the very least, warn him, or do something, anything. But she lied. She lied to keep the peace. Peace. That ended when Inko died. It hit Masaru like a truck. The two knew each other back in high school, and along with her, himself, and Inko, they were inseparable. When Inko met Hisashi, Masaru was happy for her. When Hisashi practically abandoned Inko and Izuku when the boy was no older than 3 years old, Masaru was always there for her, calling her to make sure she was okay. So, it came as no surprise that when Inko died, he spiraled. At that point, everything was still okay. He didn't drink, but he did say and do less at the house. Around a year after she died, he started drinking, and that was when the problem started. What was worse was that Izuku was missing, and presumed dead by police. They suspected him of being the reason behind Inko's death a while ago, especially seeing as he had a record for second-degree manslaughter at the age of 11. But, when he completely dropped off the edge of the earth, they declared him missing, and presumed him dead. At that point, Mitsuki gave up hope that she'd ever get an answer as to what happened to Inko because chances were that Izuku had the answers. But if he was missing, or worse, dead, then there was no getting closer. And so, as she sat on the couch, still mourning her best friend's death, flipping through TV channels absent-mindedly, Mitsuki closed her eyes and prayed silently that something, anything, would help to come and turn things around. To show her a sign that life would get any easier. And, like magic, a knock came on the door. Her eyebrow raised and glanced over at the wooden door with a hint of curiosity. If it had been Katsuki or Masaru, they would have opened the door and walked in. Neither would have bothered to knock, so that in of itself was rather curious. "Who's there?" Mitsuki called out, earning no reply. Slowly, she stood up, walking toward the door to check through the peephole. Standing up close to the door was a suited individual, though she couldn't make out any exact features, other than that they were male. Reaching for the lock, Mitsuki unlocked the door but kept the chain in place as she slowly opened the door. Peeking out of the crack, she looked up to see the face of the person who stood on her front step, and what she saw caused whatever cautious expression that had been on her face to drop instantly, being replaced with what could only be described as confusion, joy, and sorrow. The person in question had greenish-black hair, crimson-red eyes, and pale skin with a few freckles dotting around the cheeks. He wore a black and white fedora and a black suit with a white dress shirt underneath. For legwear, he wore a pair of black jeans, and for footwear, he wore a pair of black dress shoes. Am I interrupting something, Bakugo-san? Or perhaps, I came at a bad time? The mystery boy asked as Mitsuki, who still lurked behind the chained door, felt so many different emotions in that one small sentence. She hadn't even realized that she unhooked the lock on the door as the boy let himself in, his red, cat-like eyes glancing over her as he entered the home. Taking off his suit jacket and placing it on the coat hanger, the boy faced Mitsuki, a small smile on his face. Izuku, is that really you?" Mitsuki whispered, her tone one of disbelief. He was nearly as tall as her now, maybe the same height as Katsuki now. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and his smile became more benevolent. "It's been a while, Auntie. How about we have a nice cup of coffee and catch up? I'm sure you want answers." "And I'll try and give them to the best of my ability," Izuku replied as the two looked at one another. It was so surreal. Seeing Izuku alive was just so strange. Not in the bad kind of strange, far from it, but definitely strange. She believed the boy to be dead for the last 4 years, and now here he was, 15 years old, standing in front of her with a smile on his face as if nothing was wrong. A part of Mitsuki felt bitter and a little entitled. It had been so long, and he had been alive this entire time. Why hadn't he come forward sooner? Why hadn't he shown up at all? Where was he this whole time? What had he been doing that he considered more important than checking up on family and friends? Where was he at Inko's funeral? So many questions, with very few answers, some of which would be heartbreaking. Some of those questions she wouldn't bother to ask, namely the funeral one. Chances were that he didn't want to go because of some reason or another. It wasn't her place to ask, but she did want to know the other answers to those other questions she had. And so, she agreed to have a cup of coffee with the boy. It was a good idea, and besides, it had been a while since she had a cup of coffee with, well, anyone. The two walked into the kitchen and fixed themselves 2 cups. Izuku didn't put anything in his, leaving it black. He didn't seem perturbed by it either, which was an interesting development. Then again, from what she remembered about the boy, it was that his taste buds never really worked, so perhaps he didn't see the need to add anything to his coffee. Personally, she liked it with 2 cream and 2 sugar. But that was neither here nor there. The two sat down at the kitchen table, and when they did, Izuku clasped his hands together. Well, I'm willing to answer any question you want. However, I must advise you that any answer I give to you will be between the two of us. No one else. Got it? Otherwise, I will not be answering any questions, Izuku said, his eyes narrowed, which gave off this almost commanding aura from the teen, almost intimidating her. It didn't feel right. And the strange part about it was that it worked. For a split second, she was afraid of Izuku. Afraid of what he might do if he found out that she said anything to anyone else after their conversation. But why? Why was she afraid? There was nothing to be afraid of, right? It wasn't as if he was a bad person or anything. He was still the same old Izuku Midoriya from before. He even looked the same, just with a little bit more muscle to his body. That was it. She let out a nervous chuckle, before nodding. I understand, Izuku, Mitsuki replied as the green and black-haired teen nodded, dropping the serious expression and narrowed eyes for a more relaxed look. The two sat in silence, taking sips from their coffees every so often, before finally, a question came to Mitsuki's mind. One that she had been wondering about for years. What happened to Inko, Izuku? Mitsuki asked, as Izuku seemingly froze. His shoulders tensed, and his eyes took on an almost shocked gleam. Like he wasn't expecting her to ask that. Which made no sense. Why wouldn't he expect her to ask that? Regardless, she continued. When I found her body, it looked like she had been partially eaten. Like someone came into the house and tore her apart. The police couldn't find your body, even though they were looking for it, because they had suspected you to be dead. When they couldn't find a body, you were seen as a suspect. Then you never showed up, and a year later, you were declared missing and presumed dead, though with possible connections to the crime scene. If you know anything, Izuku, please, tell me, Mitsuki said, her tone pleading. She was desperate for answers as to what happened to Inko. Of who did it. And Izuku might have known. That might have been the reason why he ran away, because he was afraid to say anything. Maybe it was a criminal gang that threatened him into silence. Henceforth why he ran away? She needed to know, and she needed to know today. For her peace of mind. Izuku let out a shaky sigh, taking another sip of his coffee. When he put his mug down, a haunted look appeared in his eyes as he clasped his lips together. She could tell he was clenching his teeth by the way his jaw hardened and by the way his eyebrows furrowed. And then he spoke. Auntie. Never ask me that question again. I don't want to relive that night. It traumatized me. All you need to know is that what happened that night was never supposed to happen. I could have stopped it, but I was too scared to face the consequences of what would have happened if I attempted to stop it. Izuku explained, looking over at Mitsuki with a hardened glare. I saw it all go down. My mother was cannibalized, but that's all I can say. I can't say who, because I never got to see their face. I can't say how they left, because I hid after she fell. All I know is that they're still out there and that I've been searching for them ever since. Mitsuki lowered her head to look at the ground. He's just as much in the dark about all of it as me, damn it. The blonde thought, sighing, before looking back at Izuku with a small smile. I'm sorry, Izuku. I knew I shouldn't have asked that question, but I just thought you might have known something. Mitsuki was shocked to see a small smile on his face after that response. She half expected him to get mad, but he didn't. It's all right. You thought I knew something, so you asked. I was at the scene of the crime, so I was bound to have some form of information. Just not the kind you're looking for, Izuku replied as he took another sip of coffee. Any other questions? Mitsuki tapped her chin, trying to think of something to say, anything, but found herself at a loss. It was only then that she thought of something. "Oh. Where do you live now, anyway? You clearly don't live in that old apartment complex in downtown Mizudafu, so where are you now?" Izuku chuckled, rubbing at the back of his head. "I'm homeless. I just hop around hotel to hotel with whatever money I can scrounge up," Izuku said, a small smile on his face. "It's not the best, but fast food doesn't pay all too well. I have just enough to eat and get clothes from the Salvation Army. I lucked out with this suit. It only cost me 1,250 yen. Sure, it had to be washed a bit, but it came out nice enough." Izuku finished as he leaned back in his chair. "I know it's not what you expected, but it's just how my life is. I got dealt a bad hand, but I'm taking it in stride," Izuku said, sighing. "Anything else?" "I'm kinda busy, and I have things I need to do. My manager is gonna kill me if I'm late to work today. I'm supposed to take a double shift from 5 to 9, then 9 to 12. I'm already late enough as it is, but if I'm any later—" Mitsuki frowned, but understood what he was getting at. He had his priorities, and she wasn't going to keep him for too long. "Well, I have one more question, Izuku." Mitsuki started as Izuku raised an eyebrow, signaling for her to continue. "I was wondering if you could stay for dinner tonight. I'm sure everyone would want to see you again, and even if it's only once. I feel like I owe this to your mother in some regard." Izuku once again clamped his jaw shut. He seemed conflicted, but after a few seconds, he sagged in his chair before sighing. "I don't see the issue. I guess I can take the verbal lashing from my manager. All right, I'll stay for dinner. But after dinner, I have to leave, okay?" Izuku replied, a sense of worry in his voice. Why worry? What was he so worried about? Did he fear his manager that much? If so, then why even work in that environment? Mitsuki nodded, a little concerned for Izuku, but otherwise happy that he was willing to stay for dinner. The blonde-haired woman stood up from her chair and got straight to work preparing dinner. Getting out the cutting board and a few vegetables and some chicken breasts, with a few cups of rice, Mitsuki decided that tonight she'd make stir-fry. Stir-fry wasn't exactly one of her favorite meals, but it was one of Katsuki's. Granted, that was only when she put some jalapenos in it, as well as some habaneros, which she was doing, but otherwise, it was one of his favorites. She looked over her shoulder from time to time to see Izuku sitting at the table, scratching at his hand as his fingers drummed against the table in a rhythmic pattern. He seemed anxious. Why? Why was he anxious? Maybe he was anxious about seeing Katsuki again. It was possible. Speaking of Katsuki, where is that boy? Mitsuki thought as the sound of the front door opening and closing reverberated throughout the house. Oi! Hag! I'm home. Katsuki's booming voice ripped throughout the house like a shockwave, catching Mitsuki's attention. She was about to call out to him, but Izuku shook his head. Mitsuki raised an eyebrow but understood what he was getting at. He wanted to surprise Katsuki, which at first confused her, but she assumed that it was his way of pranking him. So, she said nothing, going along with whatever Izuku might have had in mind. Footsteps drew closer to the kitchen as Katsuki spoke up again. Oi, Hag! I said I'm home. Katsuki stated as he stepped into the kitchen. When he did, his eyes widened at seeing Izuku, who smiled at him. Why, hello there, Kaken. It's been a while. I guess I have some explaining to do. Izuku said, his tone of voice slightly cheery. Katsuki stood there, blinking a few times, before he went pale in the face and started to fall backwards. Mitsuki dropped everything that she was doing to go catch the boy before he hit his head against the counter corner, only for something to snap past her. She only saw it for a second, but when something wrapped around Katsuki like a vine, her eyes followed the black string-like wire from where it wrapped up Katsuki's torso to keep him from falling further, all the way to Izuku, who had 4 of those strange bungee cord things protruding from his back. His face had a neutral expression written on it as he stood up. I'll go lay him down on the couch. When he wakes up, I'll answer whatever questions he might have, so long as I can answer them. You focus on making dinner. Do not worry about your son, Izuku said in a monotone voice, his expression completely blank with the exception of a soul-piercing gaze, before walking Katsuki, who was still wrapped up in that strange binding, over to the living room couch. Mitsuki felt a tad uncomfortable but went with it. So many questions shot through her mind all at once. Had Izuku's quirk changed since the last time they saw each other? What were that blank thousand-yard stare and the monotone voice for? Just what had happened for the otherwise cheery Izuku to turn into such a shell of his former self? She assumed that part of it had to do with Inko's death, and perhaps that Natsumi girl's passing, but there had to have been something else. There was something he wasn't telling her. However, she reasoned with herself that he was probably doing it on purpose. Izuku was smart, scarily so. If he didn't want to speak about something, he wasn't going to. No amount of goading would work, and she knew that. And seeing as it would have been fruitless to try and argue with him about something he seemed dead set on doing, she did as she was asked, and continued to prepare the stir-fry. To say Izuku had dodged a bullet was a complete overstatement. He had debated about showing his face to the Bakugo family for a long time, and ever since he began his stint as the hero cannibal, he believed that going out of his way to see them would have been wasted. After all, he only had one shot in life, one appearance, and if he threw it away to clean up loose ends, then it would have been all for nothing. Then, he found out about his shape-shifting abilities thanks to his predecessor, and after that, he knew he had to take his chance, or else risk having someone connect the dots as to who his identity would be as the hero cannibal. His plan was simple. Approach the home of the Bakugos as a completely different person, his Izumi Sugiyama appearance, then morph when no one was looking, enter the household, then kill them all in one fell swoop. There was only one small hiccup. Well, two actually. One, he hadn't really eaten anything today, and his freezer back at his house was now empty, meaning he'd have to refill it by taking a vagrant off the street or finding another pedophile in his complex, which wasn't all too hard, as sad as that sounded. He knew he was reaching his hunger limit, and if he didn't eat something by 6:30 p.m., he was going to snap and eat someone innocent, something he vowed to never do again after he killed and devoured his mother that fateful spring night. 2. Only Mitsuki was home. Katsuki was nowhere to be seen, and Uncle Masaru's car wasn't in the driveway. This led to two possible outcomes. Katsuki wasn't home because he was at the arcade, and Masaru was still at work. Or, the second option, aka the more nonsensical one. Katsuki was dead somehow, and Mitsuki and Masaru were divorced. As far as he was concerned, while the second option was more favorable for his current situation, it seemed too unrealistic. The only way he could ever see Katsuki dying was either by his hands or by some other villains. That, and the idea of Mitsuki and Masaru having a divorce made no sense to Izuku. After all, they were meant for each other. Why would they divorce? But, outside of those two issues, everything seemed fine. Everything was going to go exactly according to plan. Once Masaru and Katsuki got home, he would enact his plan and go home as if nothing ever happened. And then he saw the faint bruises on Mitsuki's face and arms through the poorly concealed makeup. He saw the joy in her eyes upon seeing him, as well as the sadness. He saw the pain and sadness when he denied her the information about what really happened to his mother. And that was when his plan fell to pieces. He couldn't kill her. Hell, his other idea of turning her into a demon was also something he refused to do. Aunt Mitsuki was just that, his aunt. He wasn't going to turn her into a flesh-eating monster. He wasn't going to kill her either. He was a monster, a demon, yes, and he'd kill anyone who stood in his way, no matter who they were, so long as their death wasn't meaningless. He was not, nor would he ever be, a cold, heartless, vile monster that killed others for the sake of killing them. Not unless things took a drastic turn. He saw no reason to kill Mitsuki, or the Bakugos, for that matter. A part of him was disgusted that he even thought of that idea in the first place. Their deaths would have been meaningless. All save for potentially one. Katsuki's. As far as Izuku was concerned, Katsuki could very well turn out to be a threat. His quirk, explosion, wasn't exactly a threat to him, per se, but it was his actions, his words, and his intellect that scared him. Katsuki was more than just a brute with a powerful quirk. Izuku knew that and then some. Katsuki was intelligent. Katsuki was strong. And Katsuki, when he wanted to be, which was usually most of the time, was scary. His actions, his goals, and his ambitions were something to fear, as they directly opposed his own goals. Katsuki wanted to be the #1 hero. Katsuki wanted to use the commercialization of heroics to become a celebrity, for people to cheer his name and to be seen as the strongest hero, even stronger than All Might. Izuku wanted to be the greatest villain Japan had ever known. He wanted Japan to rue the day it made heroics commercialized and mainstream, to forever root out fake heroes who used the title of hero to cover up their horrendous acts. Katsuki was loud and in your face about everything he did, and did everything on the fly rather than take hours to make an elaborate plan because he was good at thinking on his feet and issuing orders. Izuku liked to plan things out ahead of time, learn about his enemies, get inside their heads, and destroy them from within before ultimately killing and eating them. In other words, Katsuki was the complete antithesis of Izuku, and it was in that which Izuku wanted him dead. If he was dead, he wouldn't have to worry about him in future. Or so, he thought. Because when Katsuki saw him in the kitchen after he gave the boy a rather taunting greeting, rather than lunge at him and attack him, shouting at him for being gone for so long and demanding answers, Katsuki fainted. Katsuki Bakugo fainted. He passed out. He showed weakness. There was no second wind, there was no spunky way of brushing it off, he just passed out. He fainted. Something had changed. Katsuki had changed. A sentence, nor thought, that Izuku ever would have believed possible. It was why he entered a somewhat monotone state. It made no sense to Izuku. The bombastic bully Katsuki Bakugo, Kaken, whatever his name was to Izuku now, no longer had the same spunk he used to have in him. But that made no sense. How did Izuku see that? Simple. He saw it in his eyes for the split second that he wasn't reacting to his appearance. His eyes were devoid of that spark. His eyes reeked of depression, of loneliness, of being lost. Katsuki was a shell of his former self. Or, better put, the Katsuki Bakugo Izuku Midoriya knew back in Aldera Junior High was dead, and whoever this guy was who shared the face and name of Katsuki Bakugo took his place. It seemed so outlandish, so unbelievable, that it threw everything he knew about the Bakugos through a loop. His plan had been utterly dismantled, and his goals for tonight were in tatters. And now he had to survive dinner with them without going feral and devouring them because now he believed that their deaths would serve no purpose to him. Sure, they knew he was alive. Sure, they knew his face. But none of them knew he was the hero cannibal or a demon. They didn't know his current life, they didn't know his new name of Muzan Kibutsuji, they knew nothing of his other alter ego of Izumi Sugiyama who he created on the spot for Ochaku Uraraka's initial transformation into a demon, one that he was now going to use as the hero cannibal from here on out. In other words, killing them would do nothing for him in the long run. Of course, then there was Masaru, who he hadn't seen yet. He knew Katsuki would never lay a hand on his mother for any reason, no matter how annoying he thought her to be. That meant that Uncle Masaru had a fall from grace. If there was anyone within the Bakugo family he would kill, it would most likely be Masaru, though that depends if he raises a hand to Mitsuki in his line of sight. He didn't want to assume anything. After all, assuming things led to conflicts and complications later down the road. And the last thing he needed was complications. It was why he had sprung forth his original plan, to begin with. But now that it was null and void, he now had to play a dangerous game of biding his time. Which led him to now, sitting across from Bakugo's unconscious form, his face rigid and contemplative. It was 5:45 p.m. right now, meaning he had about another 45 minutes to leave before something bad happened. He could already feel his fingers twitch and his hunger wash over him, as dull as it might have been. He had been sitting there for what felt like 5 minutes, and Katsuki had yet to awaken. Naturally, Izuku was starting to get annoyed, and so, he did the only thing that seemed reasonable at that moment in time, slap him across the face to wake him up. Needless to say, one slap to the cheek and a jolt of energy later, Katsuki was sitting up, blinking rapidly and looking around the room. When crimson red eyes landed on Izuku, they immediately widened, before narrowing into angry slants. "Cat eyes, you're alive?" Izuku shrugged. "Well, considering I'm in front of you, breathing, I'd have to assume that means I am alive," Izuku quipped, sarcasm dripping from his tone. Katsuki looked away, unable to make eye contact with him. Izuku smirked, crossing his arms as he reclined in his chair, one leg over the other as he sighed. "I know you must have questions, seeing as you thought me dead until recently. So, in light of that, I will answer any question you have to the best of my ability, so long as it has nothing to do with my mother. I do not wish to relive that memory." Izuku shivered for added effect. Truth be told, he really didn't want to relive that memory. But he knew that if he said anything about it, it would draw suspicion from Katsuki. Bless Aunt Mitsuki's soul, but she was a bit naive when it came to him. Katsuki, on the other hand, would poke holes in the story that he told Mitsuki, so relaying that to him would only make him question the truth. Denying the option for him to ask about that day would not only save him from a headache but also make it so he didn't have to force himself to kill them. He wasn't here to cause harm to the Bakugos, not anymore at least. Whatever. That's all I wanted to know about. Since you're not going to talk about that, I'm going to head to my room. Don't waste my time, cat eyes, Katsuki spat, standing up from the couch and leaving the room altogether. Izuku blinked, a tad bit shocked. He had expected Katsuki to have more than just that to ask. But if that was all he cared about, that makes my life easier, Izuku thought, sighing out of relief. When he did, however, Katsuki turned around and glared at him. "But I want to know one thing. Why'd you kill those villains?" Katsuki asked, making Izuku freeze in place. "What villains?" Izuku asked, his voice cautious as Katsuki narrowed his eyes. "The ones that killed that cat girl. Why'd you do it? Why didn't you just let the heroes handle it? Why would you throw away your future for some girl you barely even knew?" Katsuki stated, his voice cold, yet curious. Izuku felt his shoulders tense, before huffing out hot air. "I knew her for a year, Bakugo. She was my friend. My friend was being actively murdered in that alleyway for some dumb reason or another, and two heroes were standing around doing nothing, letting it happen. I stepped in and saved my friend. Until I didn't. If I had been just a few minutes sooner, if I had been quicker in my actions, if I hadn't run away from her in the first place, then maybe she'd still be alive," Izuku lamented, turning to face Katsuki with a glare. Katsuki, for his part, shrank in the glare that Izuku sent his way. This caught Izuku off guard but shrugged it off nonetheless. "In short, Bakugo. They deserved it. I did the heroes' jobs for them. Those bastards knew what was coming for them. I might have a criminal record, but I don't regret it for even a moment. And if I had to do it again, I would, 1,000,000 times over if I had to." Katsuki clicked his tongue against his teeth, before leaving the living room and heading up the set of stairs that led to his bedroom. Mitsuki, who stood in the doorway of the kitchen, had a small somber smile on her face. She didn't say a word, only retreating back into the kitchen. Izuku's stomach grumbled as he paled. He was getting hungry. Now, scratch that, he was hungry. He could feel saliva drip down from the corners of his mouth as his eyes shrunk into smaller slits. Clamping a hand over his jaw, he glanced over to the kitchen, then spoke. "Aunt Mitsuki. I will return in a moment. I must deal with something. My manager texted me, saying that I need to be back at the location immediately." Izuku lied as Mitsuki called out from the kitchen with an okay. That was all Izuku needed, confirmation to leave. Slipping on his shoes, he ran for the front door and ducked out of it faster than he had any right to. Unbeknownst to him, Katsuki watched him leave through his bedroom window, his eyebrow arched the whole time. The blonde bomber opened his window and dangled his legs out of it before propelling himself out of the window, softening the landing with a pair of small explosions, before then following Izuku. As for Izuku, he ducked into an alleyway and transformed into Izumi Sugiyama. When she did, her body began to go through the same metamorphosis as it did the last time. Shivering at the change once again, Izumi frowned, looking down at her body again. "I will never get used to this," Izumi whispered, exiting the alleyway as she patted down her pants. She had to find someone to eat, and fast, otherwise she was going to lash out at a random passerby. And so, the hunt began. All the while Katsuki was right on her tail, eyes widened as he watched Cat Eyes, who had entered the alleyway as a dude, only to come out of it a woman. He knew it was him based on the hair color and the same eyes. That, and the outfit was the exact same, so there was also that. Did Cat Eyes just change genders? What the hell is going on? Katsuki thought, a headache coming on stronger than he had been anticipating. But one thing was for certain. Katsuki was going to get to the bottom of this, and he was going to get to the bottom of this now. Just what the hell had happened to Cat Eyes over the last 4 years, and how the hell could he change his appearance at the drop of a hat like that? So many questions, and the only person who could answer those questions was the person that he just watched walk out of the alleyway. And if there was one thing he knew about Cat Eyes, it was that he was tight-lipped when it came to secrets, especially when they revolved around himself. All he had to do was get his answers and leave. What could possibly go wrong? Stalking down an alleyway in some city that she had no idea what the name of it was due to her mind blanking at it, Izuku was swaying left to right, scoping out for anyone that she could get her teeth on. She was hungry, and if she didn't curb her hunger pangs, she was going to end up attacking an innocent bystander. On her walk, she had to restrain herself from lashing out at some of the passers-by on the sidewalk. It was a struggle, especially when a few of them had freshly cut wounds and drew her in ever so slightly. The whole point of the Izumi disguise that she was wearing at the moment, that she had turned into, was to not only cover her public image as the hero cannibal, but it also served two purposes. Abusing human nature, specifically other male humans, to act upon their natural urges. It was no secret that humanity was a perverse species. Being a demon didn't allow Izuku to feel such urges, at least, at a normal level. Even as a preteen, which was around the time a boy like herself would have felt that change, the innate desire to find something, anything to do something to, or to even relieve herself of that metaphorical tension, she did not feel it. In fact, she simply did not have a reason to feel such things. Oh, sure, she could feel pleasure, everything could, but she simply wasn't attracted to anything. It probably had something to do with her demonic nature, and if that was the case, then she was sort of envious of humanity. However, that also presented a perfect way of attracting prey, and some types of fake heroes. Even Izuku had to admit, in this female form, she was attractive. Not the height of beauty standards, mind you, but definitely attractive to some degree or another. And a common thing she noticed with certain fake heroes, most of which turned out to be pedophiles or rapists, which was a worrying trend that she was beginning to notice, all of their targets were young teens, around the age of 13 to 15, and all of them were considered to be attractive by conventional beauty standards, boys or girls. And while that thought alone disgusted her, this recent trick she developed could help her track down and devour more of those pathetic fakes. She was willing to risk whatever it was she had to in order to keep her rate up. For fakes a month, that was her goal. Sometimes she killed 5 a month if she got lucky, but her standard goal was usually 4. 2 weeks into this month, she had only killed 1. She was underperforming. So part of this current strategy that she was using to not only stave off her hunger but to catch some fake heroes that were on her list, one of which was a pro by the name of Electivire, who was rumored to be a wife-beater and a serial child groomer and child abuser similar that of he who shall not be named, minus the grooming part, was someone she had her sights on for a while. and currently he was positioned in Mizudafu. If she searched long enough, she might be able to find him. And if she did, she was going to make him pay for his crimes. Several snarling voices ruptured in her mind, telling her to feast on the nearest human, but she ignored them. She wasn't about to abandon her principles just because she was hungry. She wasn't about to abandon everything she held herself to because she needed to eat. Izuku was better than that. She knew she was better than that. Hell, as far as she was concerned, the moment she sank her teeth into an innocent person's flesh would be the day that she forewent her promise to her late mother. And that was something she could never do. Ever. And then, the strangest of things happened. Running down the same alleyway she was in was a little girl. She had snow-white hair and a single small, 3 centimeters tall horn sticking out of the side of her head. She was dressed in rags, with bandages covering her arms and legs. She had pale skin and maroonish-colored eyes, bordering on red, similar to her own. The little girl fell flat on her face, trying to get up, as several more footsteps came running from the sidewalk in front of the alleyway. "The girl's gotta be here. Hurry up, or else the boss is gonna have a conniption because we couldn't find her." "That's easy for you to say. He used his quirk on me the last time we couldn't find her." "You don't know shit, newbie. Fuck off." "Oh?" Izuku thought, looking over to the girl, who was trying to get up, but seemingly couldn't. The more that Izuku looked at her, the more her blood boiled. The girl was malnourished, and the closer she looked at the little kid, the more she saw what appeared to be bloodstains seeping from her bandages, like reopened wounds. They must be looking for her, but why? Izuku thought, reaching out to grab the girl by the collar of her ragged dress. The girl gasped as Izuku stood her up straight. Before the girl could say anything, Izuku put a clawed finger to her lips and shushed her before pointing behind the trash bin. "Hide." Once Izuku said that, the little girl didn't even think twice about it and ran to hide behind it. It was then that the 3 men, all of which appeared to be the same, though one had a yellow ball for a head, entered the alleyway. The one with the bald head looked at Izuku, then frowned. "Oi, we heard you telling someone to hide. It wouldn't happen to be a little girl, would it?" The bald-headed man asked as Izuku narrowed her eyes. "And if it was?" Izuku asked, fanning out her clawed fingers on her left hand. The thug scoffed, walking up to her with a wry grin on his face. "Then we have ways of making you talk." The thug wasn't even given a second to react, as the sound of a sword slashing through bone and skin rang throughout the alleyway. The man with the bald head stood there, eyes wide, as the rest of the thugs looked in confusion. "Oi! Tokata, what the hell are you?" And then, the man with the ball for a head fell to the ground in 5 separate vertical pieces, as blood cascaded to the floor. The other 3 thugs looked at Izuku with wide eyes, shaking in place as Izuku's expression didn't change from the same neutral expression she had been wearing the entire walk. She summoned her bone whips out of her back, the thin black tendrils waving around like bobbing serpents, waiting to strike, as Izuku spoke. "I don't suppose you all want to run away now, right? I'd hate to expose such a little girl to such violence." That was exactly what they did. They ran away. Izuku would let them. They could tell their boss what happened all they liked. This boss of theirs was no match for her, or what she could do at a conceptual level. She was faster. She was stronger. She was more durable than any lowly human. Izuku knew that she was, and that was all she needed to put herself on top of every other human being in all of existence. But even still, looking down at the corpse of the man that she turned into mincemeat, an idea came to mind. For a split second, she considered turning them into a demon. But then, she paused on that thought, mentally shook her head, and kicked the remains into a corner. A part of her screamed at her, proclaiming why she didn't eat the remains right then and there, but the more rational side of her reminded the feral side that there was a child just a few steps away and that the child didn't need to see that. "You can come out if you like," Izuku spoke, imitating her late mother's motherly tone. It was soothing, calming, and meant to break down defenses. That, and she had imbued it with something she had been theorizing that she could do. Due to her status as the above human, she considered for a moment that her brain waves were stronger than that of humans. Taking into account that she had complete control over her body to the very atom, she considered for a moment that, perhaps, she could imbue her speaking voice with her naturally superior brain waves and force the person, or persons, she was talking to do as she said. And so, she decided to use this child as her very first test run of this on-the-spot ability. Lo and behold, the girl came out of hiding. Whether that was because the ability worked, or she simply decided to come out of her own volition, was completely up in the air. Turning her head ever so slightly to look at the little girl, the child recoiled at her gaze. That was something that she was familiar with. Her stare was quite intimidating. Not to mention she was hungry, so there was also that added sense of intimidation lurking in her eyes. "What is your name, little one?" Izuku asked, once again testing out this new ability of hers, to which the little girl answered in a quiet, shaky, barely audible voice. "Yeri." Izuku hummed. "Eri, what a beautiful name," the demon commented, walking over to the little girl and kneeling to her level. The little girl flinched, taking a step back. Izuku gave her a reassuring smile before outstretching her hand toward her, palm to the sky, offering it to the girl. "Come now. I won't hurt you. I want to help you. You seem lost and alone. You're also frail, and from looks alone extremely malnourished. I dare say that whoever's looking after you isn't doing a good enough job, don't you think?" The little girl, Eri, looked at Izuku with a conflicted gaze. She could tell that Eri was either extremely untrusting of others, which was fair considering she looked like she had been put through the ringer already, but that she also wanted to trust Izuku, considering she had saved the little girl from her would-be attackers. Izuku looked at the ground, averting her eyes from the girl as she thought of something. There were a few things she could do. She didn't know if it would be a smart idea, or if it'd even work, but judging by how reserved the girl was being, and judging from the bandages and wounds alone, she was clearly being abused wherever it was that she was living. Instinctively, she wanted to go there herself and deal with the bastards, but at the risk of exposing herself to a giant organization that could have a few stragglers would have been a bad idea. Oh, she could easily beat them, whoever they might have been. It wasn't an issue of not being powerful enough, the issue was that she didn't want the attention. No. If she was going to reveal herself to the public and give them a face to the hero cannibal, it would have to be during something big. Something worth her time. Not a random gang of thugs. Then there was the idea she was having. Turning the little kid into a demon so that she could exact revenge herself. However, there was a chance that it could fail. She had seen what happens to those who fail to acclimate to her blood. They turned into flesh globs. And the last thing she wanted was to run the risk of having a little child melt before her eyes. Her vision wandered to the lip of the alleyway, where a wide-eyed, blonde-haired, familiar-looking teenager stood. And then, another idea came to mind. "Ah, young man. Come here for a sec. Cat Eyes, is that you?" "Shit," Izuku thought, narrowing her eyes. "I beg your pardon?" Izuku asked, playing dumb and hoping that Bakugo would either call it a misunderstanding, or think he was seeing things, or whatever and come over anyway. Only for that idea to be stripped away as the blonde bomber continued. "I saw you turn from a dude to a girl. I watched you do it, I know it's you." Bakugo shouted, glaring at him. "You just killed someone. What the fuck?" Izuku once again narrowed her eyes, retracting her hand away from the little girl, before standing up, her narrowed eyes turning into a glare. "Yes. I did. Your point? No reason on turning back now. She might as well get it over with. They were chasing after this little girl. This clearly injured, malnourished, little girl. No one was willing to help her, so I did. Do you have a problem with that?" Bakugo looked away, clearing his throat before speaking. "No. It's not that I have a problem with. You saved her, that should be all that matters. But, you still killed them. The cat eyes I knew would never kill. The cat eyes I knew was a wimp. As Bakugo said that, he looked at Izuku with narrowed eyes, before asking a question that was pretty bold of him to ask, at least, in Izuku's opinion, anyway. What the fuck happened to you? Izuku scoffed, turning back into her man form, his true form, which didn't really change much aside from the reduction of his chest, his genitals changing, and his arms bulking up a slight bit more than they were before. What happened to me? My mother was murdered, Bakugo. That's what happened. I've lived on the streets for the last 4 years of my life, seen things that no one should ever see, do things that no one should ever have to do to survive. A little murder here and there never hurts someone, especially when it's your only means of survival. I grew a spine, Bakugo. That's what happened. Bakugo winced, looking away from the green and black-haired teen, as Izuku sighed. There were several things that he could do in this situation. His cover was blown. Bakugo knew he could morph between genders, or any form, really, and he knew of his newfound strength if he saw him slice that guy in 5 separate pieces, so the smart thing to do was to kill him right here, right now. But then, another idea came to mind. An idea that, in hindsight, he thought was way better than just killing Bakugo, or turning him into a demon, which was his second idea, though he shot that down, just in case he turned out like Uraraka, disobedient to a fault, and only acting in her self-interest. No, his third idea was far better than that. He could already see it perfectly in his head, and on the inside, he smirked. Yes, that will do just nicely. Do me a favor, Bakugo. Keep this between us, and take the girl home with you, Izuku said, as the little girl looked surprised. She needs a better home. I'm sure your mom could take care of her with ease. Unless, of course, you can think of a reason why that wouldn't be a good idea? Bakugo grunted, sticking his hands into his pants pockets. She needs to go to a hospital. And my house isn't exactly good for little kids. Dad's a drunkard now ever since Auntie Inko's passing. Not stable for a kid like her. Izuku sighed. Well, she can't come with me on the account that I'm homeless. And I'm not about to send her to a shitty orphanage. I don't trust heroes for my own personal reasons, so that scratches out option number 3. That leaves option number 1. Take the kid, Bakugo. If your father raises a hand to her, call me, and I'll sort him out. I have a cell phone, Izuku said, taking a cell phone out of his pocket, one he had factory set that he stole from a dead fake hero, Tumblr if he remembered correctly. And while this was all pointless, namely because Izuku's plan wouldn't even give Masaru a chance to so much as blink at Eri, let alone touch her in any way, he still had to keep up the act that he was putting on. Bakugo furrowed his eyebrows, staring at Izuku for a few seconds, before ultimately giving in and shaking his head. What's your number? After a quick exchange of phone numbers, the two went their separate ways, Eri going with Bakugo back home, as Izuku smirked, staying in the alleyway. It took Izuku vouching for Bakugo for Eri to actually go with him for the time being, but at least they left. Bakugo didn't need to see what was coming up next, and Eri most certainly didn't need to see what happened next. Turning to face the corpse of the thug that had been accosting poor Eri, Izuku sneered. Scum. Utter, disgusting scum. You'll be a filling morsel, Izuku said, as he reverted back to Izumi, and without hesitation, she pounced on the corpse and began to eat. Ochako was upset. Upset at herself for what she did. She saw what happened on the news. 3 children's partially eaten corpses were found in the woods. The very woods that she had retreated to after she met Izumi, or whoever Izumi actually was, and the same place where she felt that uncontrollable hunger take her over. She recognized the children to be the same ones that had run into her. She could only eat the meat of humans, as she found out the hard way when she tried to eat machi. She threw up instantly, and after putting 2 and 2 together, she now refused to leave her apartment. She couldn't trust herself. Not anymore. Her own body was against her, and it was mortifying. She ate children. Fucking children. What the hell was wrong with her? And yet, thinking back on it, she felt nothing. She was disgusted with herself, true, but there was no hint of remorse. Despite the horrid thing that she did, she felt no remorse. None at all. It was like she had lost the capacity to feel remorse for those she ate. Those families would never see their children ever again. Those children would never get to be who they wanted to be. All because of her and her selfish hunger. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair at all. But there was nothing she could do about it. But at least that was something that she now knew about herself. Sure, she could feel remorse for other people, she still had her emotions after all, but when it came to those she ate, she couldn't bring herself to give even a single iota of a crap about them. It was jarring, to say the least, and it sucked, but there wasn't a single thing she could do about it. Oh, and there was something else that she found, interesting wasn't the word, but definitely enlightening. And it pertained around her body. Underneath her clothing, which she hadn't taken off until recently, her upper and lower halves of her body were covered in these strange black lines that made swirling patterns all around her body that moved clockwise, all of which were interconnected and looked like something of a strange Vogue-like dress, but permanently molded to her skin. It started from the base of her breasts, looping to cover her nipples, then moving down her body before meeting at a point to stop around her belly button, and then looping counterclockwise to her waist, where the same black substance pulled around her thighs and made itself to look like a parted short skirt, still leaving the gap between her legs, and pointing out the obvious. It was extremely erotic. Uraraka was never an erotic person, never had been, and never would be. Sure, she was a blushing schoolgirl, literally because her cheeks were stuck with a permanent faint blush, but she never had any lewd thoughts of anyone in particular. So, she had no idea where this design came from, and quite frankly, it made her uncomfortable. Although, something she found cool about the black streaks was that they glowed bright pink whenever she activated her supercharged quirk. However, what's more, she also found out that she didn't have genitals anymore. Or, at least, not traditionally. They were still there, but the black stuff covered it unless she physically made it go away. Well, it had its uses. Hey! At least she couldn't be sexually assaulted. So that was a plus. Not that she ever had been, but now it couldn't happen at all, not unless she willed it to happen. If there was anything she could call a plus to all of this demon nonsense, it was that she had a built-in defense mechanism that quite literally closed off her privates. But, aside from that, she still appeared human. She was just paler, and she had fangs, along with claws. And she needed to devour humans to sustain herself. But hey, she appeared human, so that's all that mattered, right? Oh. And she no longer needed to use the bathroom. Yea to no bodily functions. Well, technically, she was undead, right? And undead wouldn't need to deal with that crap anyway, right? So that made some sense. Still, it was weird to think about. But there was more. And this one was weird, but it had nothing to do with her body. Oi, Uraraka, I'm going out to get some food. You want me to bring you back something? The voice of a tall teenager with short black hair, pukish green skin, and brownish-orange eyes, wearing a black hoodie and blue ripped jeans, along with black shoes, asked as Uraraka nodded, her stomach growling. Aight, sounds good. Be back in a bit. And with that, Ito Kaneki left the apartment that both he and she now shared. Now, how the hell did this random guy show up in her life? Simple, he apparently could track her due to her link with whoever this muzan guy was. Maybe it was Izumi's real name? Or maybe another fake name. Whatever the case was, her company was good. He wasn't a prude, and he was a demon just like her. The only difference was that he seemingly didn't care what he ate, child, grown man, hero, or villain. In his own words, they're all cattle to us anyway. I don't see the difference. He had to have been a villain before being turned. Or, at the very least, he must have been a very twisted individual when he was human. There was no way he should have been able to shrug it off as he did. Either way, Ito helped out around the place, so as long as it stayed that way, and he didn't start trying to feel her up, because he seemed like the type to do so. She'd have no problems with the company. Oh, he was evil. That was easy to see, but at the same time, he was able to get money more often than her allowance would allow, and she was pretty sure that his method of money collection was killing someone, eating them, and taking their money. If she was human, she probably would have not been able to live with someone like that. But she wasn't human anymore. She was a man-eating demon. And while she hated that aspect, she understood why demons, i.e. her boss, and Ito, ate humans. They had no choice. And while the only demons she knew were Ito and her boss, whatever their name was, there was a chance that more would be created. A part of her shivered at that. What kind of world would that be? Chaotic. It would be chaotic. Uraraka thought, looking over to her arm. Pulling back the sleeve on her pink and black tracksuit, the black lines on her arm that looked like tattoos glowed the same dark pink color as she activated her boosted quirk, floating a cup of red liquid over to her. It was a cup of blood. One she had gotten from her next-door neighbor, who was now dead, cut up into little chunks in her fridge, and slowly being picked off by her and Ito. They only had a leg and a hand left over from the guy's corpse, hence why Ito was out grocery shopping. God, what would Mom and Dad think of me now? I haven't called them in a few days, and I've passed the date of the weekly check-in. Uraraka thought, sipping out of the cup of blood with an almost nonplussed expression. She didn't want to talk to them. Not because she was on bad terms with them, but because she couldn't bring herself to do so. Not when she was like this. She just hoped that one day they'd forget about her and that she'd be able to move on with her life. I hope they're all right. Those debt collectors, what if they visited my parents first? What if they were killed by them? Uraraka put the cup of blood down and stood up off the ground. Stretching, she looked out the window and hissed. It was dark out. The clock on the wall said that it was 8 p.m., and it was a school night. Not that she needed sleep, which was another plus about being a demon, but still, she liked the feeling of sleep. It was the only normal thing she had left from her old life as a human. I still have to go to school. How am I going to keep my hunger under control at school? I can't just eat while I'm there. Uraraka thought, tugging at her hair. God, what am I gonna do? You can always disguise it as regular food. Cut a chunk off of a person's leg and call it a steak. I wouldn't assume it'd be too hard to do, right? Uraraka jumped at the suddenness of Muzan's, or Izumi's, or whatever the person's name was voice in her head. Looking around, she saw that no one else was there, and sighed. I forgot that you could read my mind. HNN doesn't matter. I have a job for you. Uraraka raised an eyebrow. A job? Like what? I want you to monitor the Bakugo household for someone to come home. There is someone I want you to kill and devour there. I would do it myself, but I have my hands tied at the moment. Uraraka gritted her teeth in pseudo-anger for him even suggesting that she was going to go out to eat someone, but nonetheless complied. Even if she didn't want to leave the house after what she had done, she didn't want her arm to blow up again, or worse. And who would that be? Uraraka asked. She could almost see the smile on her boss's face, and that alone scared her, but she ignored it. His name is Masaru Bakugo. He was once a good man, but now he abuses his wife and is neglectful to his son, Katsuki. He may work hard, and he may be grieving over the loss of a friend, but that gives him no excuse to abuse his wife. And with the little child on the way there with the son, I want you to get there before they do, and devour him. If the wife tries to call the police, knock her out. Uraraka felt something bubble inside her. The phrase that boils my blood felt like a real thing to Uraraka, her hand clenched into a fist as she bore her teeth in a deep, toothy frown. He didn't even have to tell her anything past he abuses his wife, and that would have been all the justification she had to do what she was told. There were certain people in this world that she would never forgive. Abusers were one of them. After all, her father's dad abused him when he was a child, that was what he told her, anyway, and that was beyond unacceptable. It was why she never referred to him as Grandpa, because he did not deserve that title. Got it. What's the address? It's 2903 Junjio Avenue. The dead body of Masaru Bakugo was found in the house at 9:30 p.m. Witnesses say that someone with brown hair and a pink and black jumpsuit entered the house and moments later came out with blood covering their face and hands. When police arrived, the suspect was long gone. Police are currently questioning the wife, Mitsuki Bakugo, and are looking for the son of the family, Katsuki Bakugo, who was not at the house that day, and also looking for the suspect in question. If you have any leads, please call the number on screen now. Katsuki stared at the TV in the McDonald's he had stopped at to get the little girl something to eat, with shrunken pupils, wide eyes, and shaky breath. He almost couldn't believe what he was seeing on the screen right now. He had to be hallucinating because there was no fucking way that it was real. Sure, he fucking hated his dad, but that was completely unacceptable. The hero cannibal attacked my house. That was the only thought in Katsuki's head. Well, not really. There were other worries surrounding that, such as, was his mom okay? How did the hero cannibal know where he lived? What was he going to do now? The little girl, Eri, looked up at Bakugo, confusion in her eyes as Katsuki glanced at the kid. Fuck, what? What am I going to do? I can't go home. Yo, Bakugo. A voice called out to him as his eyes darted over to his left. There, standing there, was a face he hadn't seen in about 2 weeks. His skin was puke-colored, and his eyes were strange. He was wearing a black hoodie and blue ripped jeans. His hands were in his pockets, and he was looking at him with a big smirk on his face. His appearance had changed drastically, seeing as his hair was also shorter, and his chin was less pointed than it was before, now smoothing out to look, well, normal, but he recognized that voice from anywhere. Fingers. Katsuki muttered as the boy approached him. His eyes were different. They looked like... Why does he have the same slitted pupils as cat eyes? Katsuki thought as Fingers scoffed. I thought you wouldn't be able to recognize me. Been a bit, hasn't it? The boy said, looking down at the girl. Oh, and you have a daughter now? Damn Bakugo, and here I thought you didn't like. Finish that sentence, and you're a dead man, the blonde bomber snarled, earning a laugh from the teen. The foo, heck do you want, anyway? And no, she's not my kid. She's a homeless rump Cat Eyes found. Did you know he was alive? Katsuki asked, his tone dejected. He was trying to distract himself from what happened, and Fingers seemed to catch on pretty quickly, following along the path of conversation. Yeah, I did, actually. I ran into him on a walk. The dude was swagged the hell out, too. White expensive fedora, designer button-up shirt with an expensive black tie, stainless white jeans, gods, the guy was dripped out. Anyway, we talked, and well, you know what, how about the two of you come to my apartment? I share it with this killer babe man, but she'd rip your throat out if she thought you're hitting on her, you feel me? The teen said as Bakugo frowned. Still has that obnoxious way of speaking, he hasn't changed one bit. Bakugo thought, glancing at Eri, who was hiding behind him, peeking out from his leg. The kid was slightly scared by his abnormal appearance, which even weirded out Bakugo to an extent. But, with no place to go, and with him really not wanting to go down to the police station at this time of night on a school night. Fine. Eri, was it? Come on, I know this guy, I trust him. Let's get moving, Bakugo said as Eri reluctantly followed, exiting the building behind Fingers. They walked through alleyway after alleyway, until they got to an apartment building. They took the stairs up the second floor, and once they got to the room in question, Fingers unlocked the door and stepped inside, ushering them inside first, before following them inside, closing and locking the door. The girl he had mentioned was at the fridge. She was wearing a black sports bra, and she had these weird tattoos all over her body. She was also wearing a pair of black yoga pants, which matched the tattoos, followed by a pair of white ankle socks. She was seemingly reaching for something in the fridge before she noticed them, slamming the door shut and looking at Ito with wide and furious eyes. Ito, what the hell are you thinking? Do you? Zip it, we'll talk in a moment, Ito stated, looking over to Bakugo and Eri. We got a guest room in the back. Only one bed though, so the girl's gonna have to sleep with you. Sorry about that, Ito said, gesturing them down the hallway. Bakugo looked wearily between the two roommates, took Eri by the hand, and hurriedly walked to the guest room. He had a very, very bad feeling about this. He didn't know why, but he did. Entering the room in question, which had been the last room on the left, he closed the door behind them and shushed Eri, leaning his ear against the door. To put it frankly, he didn't trust Ito. He looked like one of those horror monsters from movies now, and the only reason why he went with him was to avoid the cops. Not to mention, the woman, who he didn't know the name of, had brown hair and was female, duh. So, he kinda suspected anyone with that description at the moment. That, and not to mention that Ito wanted him out of there fairly quickly so that those two could talk about something that they weren't privy to, so it must have been a secret. Katsuki was never one for gossip, but at the same time, he was more worried about the kid than stupid secrets. And with Ito looking like a horror movie monster. If something happens to me, kid, I need you to hide, okay? Bakugo said, as Eri shakily nodded. Bakugo nodded back in return, before pressing his ear up to the door. The voices of the pair were muffled, but he could make it out just fine. Are you kidding me? That's what you brought. The guy whose father I just ate, and a child. Keep it the fuck down, will ya? They might air you. Now, listen, Muzan-sama told me to bring them here. Said something about wanting to get his payback or some shit on Katsuki. As for the kid, he wants to turn her into a demon, but not quite yet. For now, though, we can play things safe, act stupid, and move on. We can order fast food to the house for them, and we can eat when they go to sleep, yeah? One problem with that, what if one of them looks in the fridge, idiot? Did you think of that? Calm down, holy fuck. Yes, I did. No one else lives on this floor anymore, yeah? We can just move the corpses to the other house's fridges and sneak into there to take some to eat. That way, if they get up in the middle of the night, they won't suspect a thing. Katsuki tensed, his fists clenched into his palms, drawing blood as his teeth ground against one another. There was silence, his eyes glaring holes into the wall when one of them said something unexpected and fucking terrifying. You know he's listening, right? I can hear him clench his teeth. I can even smell the blood dripping from his palms. Oh, I'm well aware. I got the upgraded senses too, you know. Besides, he's smart, he won't do a goddamn thing. Otherwise, his mom's next. That got Katsuki's eyes to open wider than a saucer. Holy fuck. Did he plan this? Did Fingers plan this? Katsuki thought, as his eyes narrowed. The hero cannibal, he kills a lot of heroes, far faster than what a single person can do. Even Stain can't kill that many heroes in 1 month, only managing 2 a month on a good hunt. What if? A realization dawned on him, and it fucking scared him. What if the reason why they can't get a good lock on who the hero cannibal is because the hero cannibal is more than one person? What if they are actually a group of cannibals? Bakugo turned around and slumped against the door, looking at Eri with a distressed look on his face. He only just met this kid, and he just put her in harm's way. No, more than just harm's way. In the sights of a bunch of hungry cannibals. And I just put myself and a kid right into their lair. Oh fuck. What have I done? Bakugo grit his teeth, his ruby-red eyes glancing over at the small girl, Eri, hiding in the cupboard. She looked absolutely horrified, which was to be expected. His shoulders tensed, his eyes focused. He had to do something. He just didn't know what. If this had been himself from a year ago, he would have gone out guns a-blazing, consequences be damned. But, right now, with a child's safety in jeopardy, and with these cannibals having heightened senses, he wasn't about to take that risk. Although, he was confused about one thing, that being the aforementioned heightened senses. The brown-haired bitch made sense, namely because he didn't know what her quirk was, but Ito having them didn't. Ito's quirk made him elongate his fingers, not increase his senses. Whatever, regardless of that, he had to be really fucking careful with how he proceeded. One wrong move and both himself and Eri would be killed. Shit, he hadn't even known the girl for more than 5 minutes, and he got her into trouble. Shit, the kid probably hated his guts right now. He wouldn't even blame her for thinking that way. He looked over to Eri and motioned her to close the cupboard door. Much to his relief, the girl seemed to know what he meant, and Eri did just that. So long as she's safe, I might have a chance at taking these bastards out. Quirk laws be damned, this can fall under self-defense. Plus, they're villains, they don't have rights. Bakugo thought, silently standing up from the door. Clenching his hand into a fist, he collected himself, closed his eyes, and envisioned his mother. God, she must have been mortified. If this didn't pan out well, then he hoped that Izuku would look after his mom. These were cannibals, and villains. From the sounds of things, their quirks were kinda ass, Ito's being the only good one there, at least, in his opinion. His explosion would be more than enough to do significant damage to them. Not kill them, per se, but knock their asses out so he could escape with Eri, and call the cops and heroes. With his mind made up, and his body more than ready, Katsuki Bakugo opened the door and stood in the hallway. Ito was waiting there, smirking at him. Hiya there, Bakugo, Ito said as Bakugo bared his teeth, a small snarl escaping his lips as the black-haired villain raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. Whoa there, Bakugo. What's got your panties in a twist, eh? Don't hit me, you piece of shit. You're a fucking murderer. Bakugo snarled, popping off an explosion in his right hand. First it's cat eyes, but in his defense it was self-defense, and now it's you? Not only that, but you're a fucking cannibal. You sick bastard. How'd your family feel about that? Bakugo snapped, as Ito scoffed. Oh, how'd they feel? Probably shitty, considering I ate him, Ito barked back, laughing as Bakugo roared, rage coming out of every pore in his body. Rushing down the hallway, he cocked his arm back and prepared to unleash an explosion, full power, at the bastard's face. But, instead of dodging, Ito just stood there. Bakugo remained undeterred by whatever stupid thing he was planning, and once he got within arm's reach of Ito, he unleashed the explosion. With a powerful boom, the whole apartment shook, sending Ito through wall after wall, apartment after apartment, empty, might he add, until after the third wall, where Ito skidded to a halt, tripping over himself, and falling down to the ground, with half of his face missing. And normally, that would have been it. Bakugo would have felt a small modicum of regret, but not much, and then he'd focus on the brunette, who looked shocked at the sheer power he had displayed. But no, things couldn't have been simple. Because what happened next utterly confused and stunned Bakugo. Ito's head, the missing portion of it anyway, began to regenerate. It took around a second for it to be done, but it was done, and Ito seemed no worse for wear. In fact, he had a giant shit-eating grin on his face. Nice one, Bakugo. But that ain't gonna be enough. In the blink of an eye, Ito, who had been 3 apartments away, was in front of him, arm cocked back into a strike. Bakugo put his arms up to block the blow, as the fist met his guard. Instead of going flying, Bakugo was sent through the ground, down 2 floors as his back seared with pain, as did his arms. He heard screaming coming from the other tenants as he pulverized their floors on his way down, and by the time he stopped falling, he had landed squarely on an elderly couple's dining table. Groaning, Bakugo rolled off the table and fell to his hands and knees. His body felt broken, but, thanks to his adrenaline, he was mostly able to ignore it. Slowly, he began to stand up. The man of the two helped him to his feet, which he was thankful for. Young man, are you all right? The elderly woman asked as Bakugo looked up from the hole. Ito was getting ready to jump down and chase after him. With panic in his eyes, he was about to direct them to go, when Ito fell through the floor, and with his arms crossed to his chest, as he landed, he swung his arms outward, his fingers, which were glowing red, stretched out like whips, and slashed through both elderly people in a shower of blood and gore. Bakugo was barely able to duck and dodge the attack, but at what cost? Ito laughed, staring at Bakugo, who was shaken. "Aw, shucks. I missed," Ito said, his tone casual, as he looked down at one of the heads of the slashed-apart elderly folk. Reaching down, Ito dug his fingers into one of the eye sockets, yanked it out, and popped it into his mouth like a piece of popcorn. Bakugo felt bile rush up his throat, but quickly pushed it down as Ito let out a satisfied sigh. "Tastes like bubble gum. Anywho, where?" Bakugo didn't let him finish, as he socked Ito in the jaw, before then giving him a point-blank explosion to the chest, which ripped through him like a hot knife through butter. The collateral damage behind him was bad, resulting in yet another destroyed wall, but instead of being launched, Ito stood still, as if nothing had happened in the first place. Not letting that stop him, Bakugo kicked Ito's right knee out from under him, dropping him to the floor. As he fell, Bakugo blasted him with yet another explosion to the head. This time, he shot it off of him with an explosion. Then, he kicked Ito's body into the wall, before blasting Ito again with another explosion. As his fury died down, and as he stared at Ito's body, his breathing ragged, he felt a cold chill wash down his spine. He had to be dead now, right? There was no way anyone could have their head blasted off of their body, and have a massive hole burrowed through their chest, and still be alive, right? When Ito's body didn't move, Bakugo let out a sigh of relief, turning his back on Ito. He was about to exit the apartment and rush up to the floor the other villain was on when a laugh echoed throughout the apartment. Spinning around, Bakugo watched in horror as Ito placed his head back on his neck, and as the hole in his chest began to slowly regenerate, organs included. Although, he noticeably looked shaky, and the wound seemingly regenerated slower than it did with his head. Hey now, Bakugo. Don't you know not to turn your back on your opponent? You don't know if they have something up their sleeve or not. When Ito said that, as if he were drawing a gun, Ito whipped his right hand out and pointed his index finger at him, the finger glowing a bright blue, before firing off a pulse of blue energy, which shot right through Bakugo's left shoulder, making the blonde bomber stumble backward, but not before blasting Ito with another explosion, sending him through the door of the now-deceased elderly couple's apartment and into the hallway. Covering his shoulder wound with his hand, Bakugo gritted his teeth as he breathed heavily. He glanced down at the corpses and felt his stomach churn. There were limbs, sliced fingers, cut organs, and bone fragments scattered about the place. He had to get out of here. Screw taking down the villains, he needed to grab Eri and get the fuck out of here right now. His arms were bruising pretty badly, and his forearms looked a little swollen. Chances were that his arms were either broken or the bones were cracked. And if it was the latter, then goddamn, adrenaline was one hell of a pain nullifier. Looking up at the hole in the floor, he saw the other cannibal monster staring back at him. He noticed the conflicted expression on her face, and for a second he swore he saw what looked to be sympathy in her eyes. Then, she looked up, her eyes widened, before she ran away from the hole, as Bakugo, by the skin of his bloody teeth, narrowly avoided an extended arm covered with red energy. The wall was completely shattered from the attack, leaving a massive opening in the wall as the dimming sky became visible. Bakugo leapt out of the way of another extended arm, before blasting them both, a loud groan coming from the hallway. The hands grabbed the ground and slung-shot Ito back into the room, a manic smile on his face. I gotta say, Bakugo, you're pretty tough. But I should really end this now. Ito declared, as his neck and arms outstretched to meters long, his arms turning a bright red as Bakugo stumbled back at the sight. It was like staring at a goddamn monster from those pre-Quirk era's anime that his cousins loved to watch. However, as much as he wanted to stand there and look upon the bastard, he had to do something. There was an opening in the wall, one that Ito caused. All he had to do was knock him out of the building, and then he'd have the chance to escape. If Ito wasn't on his trail, he could make a dash for Eri, exit the building as fast as possible, and call for help. Readying himself, Bakugo dodged 2 swings from Ito, who laughed all the while. Ducking and dodging, while trying to look for an opening, was something that he found out was really difficult with an injured back and arms. What made things worse was that he felt the adrenaline wearing off, and he knew he wouldn't last much longer if he didn't have it. Arms flung at barely dodgeable speeds, as Bakugo used his weaker explosions to parry the attacks, making Ito hiss. The puke-skinned monster swung his head at Bakugo, ma agape, and ready to chomp down on whatever it could. The blonde bomber tried to dodge, but found himself unable to. Ito's razor-sharp teeth sunk into his undamaged shoulder, drawing blood and ripping out a chunk of his flesh in the process. Bakugo screamed as he was slapped back into the wall after Ito had chomped his shoulder. Bakugo tried to will himself to get up, but found his body not responding to him. He watched as Ito ate the chunk of flesh he had ripped out of his shoulder as his arms and neck retracted. Warm crimson-red liquid dripped from his shoulder and down his shirt as his breathing intensified. He tried to move either of his arms, but they didn't want to, and then, the pain that he was supposed to have felt washed over him as he hissed in agony. "You know, Bakugo," Ito began as he approached the blonde bomber. The cannibal monster thing that Ito had become stared him down, wiping the blood from his mouth as he spoke. "You almost had me a couple of times. I honestly don't know how I survived both the times you did damage to my head. I for sure thought I was a goner." As Ito said that, he grabbed Bakugo by the throat and slowly raised him off the ground, Bakugo's arms dangling by his sides uselessly as the swelling only got worse. Gasping for air, Bakugo kicked at the air, squirming, much to Ito's apparent amusement. "I grow tired of you. Just die already." The sound of a sword cutting through flesh and bone reverberated through the air as Ito's eyes widened. The grip around Bakugo's throat dropped completely as the blonde bomber fell to the floor with a thud. Ito's head slid off his shoulders, except, this time, Ito's body became completely unresponsive, slumping down to the ground in a heap as his body began disintegrating. When Bakugo looked up to see who it was who had chopped off Ito's head, he was greeted by a lime green and black-haired man who looked to be in his early 20s. His eyes were a dark purple, with cat-like slits. He was wearing a completely black haori and red traditional-styled shirt, and a pair of baggy white hakama pants, held together by some sort of rope-like belt. There was a sword sheath on his hip and a sword in his right hand. On his arm was a tag, and this tag read "Dead Silent." The man looked at Bakugo and smirked, reaching a hand out to him. "Come on, let's get you to the hospital. You're going to need it." What about? The other demon? She fled with a little girl in her arms. She was faster than I could have caught up with. Now come on, you're gonna die without medical attention. You're lucky to have survived this long, the man said as Bakugo's eyes widened. He tried to protest, only for a tag to be placed on his head, which had appeared seemingly out of nowhere in a red liquid-like veil that read "Sleep." And then, Bakugo was out like a light. When Izuku felt Ito's presence fade from his mind, the green and black-haired teen's first instinct was to grit his teeth and bear the loss. He knew Ito had died because he could, if only slightly, feel his death from across the city. He could feel the death of one of the demons he had created. He honestly had no idea why or how Ito died, but he wanted answers. Answers he knew he wasn't going to get. At least, not yet, anyway. At least Ochako Uraraka was still alive. And, if his last conversation was to be believed, with Eri in tow. That meant he now had to open his home to 2 more people. One of those people was Eri, and the other being Ochako Uraraka, assuming she wasn't going to try and explain to her parents that she was, well, not human anymore, but a man-eating demon. If they accepted her after that, then that showed just how much they cared for her. Otherwise, the smart idea would have been to stay with him after dropping off Eri. He hoped that they weren't being followed. And, if they were, well, whoever came against him at that moment wouldn't exactly make it out alive. However, right now, he was not at his home. No. He was somewhere else. He was at Mizudafu City's local graveyard, to be exact. He had but one task he wanted to do. Something he should have done weeks ago. Something that he needed to do. Something that he wanted to do for so long. Staring down at Natsume Nakame's grave, Izuku closed his eyes. He hadn't once visited the grave since she died. It brought back far too many negative memories. Far too many times where he had cried himself to sleep, remembering that day. The day when his life took a dip into the deep end. The day he had lost all faith in heroism. Some may call it corny. Others would call it generic. But to him, it was his life. His red, crimson eyes overlooked the finely kept grave, as the flowers that had been left by her parents had fully wilted. It seemed as if they didn't visit her often either, if not at all after that first visit. Perhaps it was for the same reasons. Perhaps it was for worse. Izuku wasn't one to pry into a grieving family's ways of coping. 1,000 different questions zoomed through his mind all at once. Was this even morally correct? Would Natsume even want to be alive after all this time? Would Natsume want to remain dead? After everything she went through that day, would she even consider him a friend? What would she think of him now? Would she even remember him? Those questions, and more, lived in his head rent-free. They came up whenever he thought about it, thought about bringing Natsume back. A part of him feared that she'd hate him. Hate him for betraying his original goal, hate him for killing and devouring people, be they fake heroes or otherwise. Opening his eyes, Izuku came back from that thought process with only one answer. And that answer was quite simple. He didn't care what Natsume would think of him. All he cared about was her being alive again. She'd still be 11 years old upon her revival, and she'd need to attend school, somehow. And, the more he thought about it, the more he thought that she'd make a great older sister for Eri, seeing as Eri was going to be living with them now. That, and he didn't want to endanger Natsume's parents, because he actually liked them. Which was why he brought the corpse of Electivire with him for Natsume's berserker-like state to feed on until she regained consciousness of her human self. Izuku sighed, dropping the body in front of the grave. His bone whips came from his back, the fleshy extensions that allowed him to pump his blood into the bodies he turned growing on the edges, while 6 others burrowed into the ground to rip the coffin out of the ground. Once the coffin came to the surface, Izuku flipped the lid off and was greeted by the years-old rotting corpse of his friend. He recoiled in disgust, but expected nothing less. It was several years old, and while most of the flesh had rotted away, leaving bone, he knew it mattered not. He could bring the dead back to life. Question was, just how restored would she be? Clearing his head of his thoughts, he had the infector whips, as he was now calling them, pierce her skin as he began to pump blood into her long dried-out, mummified body. After 3 minutes of pumping enough blood into her body to restart her heart, her skin quickly began to regrow, and cracked bones began to mend. Any organs that had been festering and rotting were quickly replenished, along with any missing muscle having been replaced. Her hair began to regrow out, replacing the old disgusting hair, with silky white locks. When her eyes opened again, yellow irises with what appeared to be rainbow scarab bore witness to the world, as her teeth bore themselves to the world. The color of her skin was an ashen pale, much like his own, as slowly she began to sit up, the only thing covering her modesty being a thin drape of whatever remained of her clothing after having been left to rot for the last 4 years, which wasn't much. His heart skipped a beat. His best friend was alive again. It made tears well up in Izuku's eyes, as Natsume's golden yellow irises widened with hunger upon making contact with the corpse of Electivire. Leaping from her casket in an animalistic frenzy, Natsume's now reanimated body leapt onto and began swiftly devouring the false hero. And all Izuku could do was smile, knowing that his best friend was alive again. And soon, her consciousness would come with it. Confusion. It was the first thing that came to her mind. What was going on? Where was she? How was she? What was she? Those four questions plagued her mind only briefly before one underlying emotion took her mind over completely. Hunger. She was hungry, starving, more like it. And she smelled food. Her eyes briefly glimpsed at the human body laying before her, but instead of feeling fear or disgust, something that she assumed she was supposed to feel, all that washed over her was the salivating need to eat. And eat she did. She knew she wasn't fully in control of herself, comparing her base carnal desire to eat to that of a starving lion. And while Natsumi knew what she was doing was wrong, there was nothing her brain was doing to prevent her from doing it. She tore the skin from muscle and muscle from bone. She ripped limbs off and devoured fingers. She ripped open the stomach and slurped back the intestines like ramen noodles. She ate the kidneys and the liver like they were nothing but snacks. She devoured the corpse of what appeared to be a hero with no remorse or no hesitation, and it disturbed her. Disturbed her to the point of fearing herself for being that weak. For allowing herself to fall into something like that. But then it dawned on her. How the hell was she alive? And then it all came rushing back to her. The pain. The agony. The violence. The bloodshed. Izuku carried her in his arms, rushing her to the hospital. Doctors placed her on a stretcher. Her want to just fall asleep. And then, nothing. She had died. She had died, and that was it. There was nothing but a dark, black, inky abyss. And then, her eyes opened again. She could breathe again. She could think again. She was alive, somehow. And the first thing she did was eat. And she ate a person's corpse. Nothing else came to her mind when she saw that body, other than food and eat. And then, she saw someone who she never thought she'd see ever again. Although, he had gotten taller and bulkier. His eyes, she still remembered his eyes as if they were something that she could never forget. The smile on his face, the tears falling down his cheeks, his messy green and black hair. Izuku Midoriya looked at her, and she looked back. He had grown so much taller. And he looked older, he looked like he was in his mid-teens. He knelt to her and placed a hand on her cheek. There was a sense of longing in his eyes, and pain. Oh God, the pain. It was almost overwhelming. Izuku, for however long she had been dead, seemed to have suffered quite a bit. And she didn't even know why. And then, he hugged her. He hugged her tightly, and it felt like she was choking to death because of it. But, where she would normally beg him to let go, she didn't need to. Because she wasn't choking to death, for some reason. I've missed you, his voice was hoarse. I've missed you so much. As he whispered, she slowly reciprocated the hug, burying her face in his shoulder. It was just instinct. She had a feeling it was because of him that she was alive again. She also had a very sick feeling that Izuku had killed that hero. But, right now, she was more focused on being alive again, more so than any moralistic outcome of how she was brought back to life. I've missed you too, Midori. Natsumi spoke, her voice dry and hoarse. She needed to drink something, anything. Izuku let go of her and produced a dress of sorts that was designed to drape over the body. She stared at it, quizzically, silently asking him why, to which he immediately caught onto, his whip-speed smarts being something she remembered liking so fondly about him, as he spoke. As much as I'm glad to have you back. You're still, what, 11, yeah? Izuku asked as Natsumi scoffed. 12, Midori, get it right. Natsumi replied as Izuku sighed, shaking his head with a small, goofy smile on his face. Well, as a 15-year-old, to avoid looking creepy to the nearest passerby, please cover yourself. I would rather not look upon a naked 12-year-old. Note me staring at your forehead, Izuku pointed out, as Natsumi inhaled sharply, snagging the dress, and running behind a tree. Once she slipped it over herself, she walked out from behind the tree, glancing at her new apparel, if only for the moment. It was a blank white, knee-high dress, with yellow flower designs decorating the thing from head to toe. It honestly made her feel old, but in a good way. It had only been when she had put the dress on did she notice her clothing had deteriorated completely, only leaving what was left of the collar of her shirt and some spare scrappings of the pants she wore on that day. There, Izuku began, as a thin smile took up his visage. That's better. Now, help me bury this body, Izuku continued, gesturing to the corpse she had just eaten a moment ago. The idea sickened her, but strangely enough, she wasn't freaking out about consuming, well, you know, a person. Izuku seemingly noticed this and bowed his head slightly. There's much I need to fill you in on. And about your continued existence, and how that might not be the last person you eat. Be they dead or alive. With that ominous note, and a chill forming down her spine, Natsume reluctantly helped Izuku put the corpse of the hero she had mostly eaten into her casket, which in of itself mortified her, you know, what with having just been resurrected and all, added onto the fact that they were replacing her body with someone else's, before Izuku placed the casket back into the ground and reburied it, making it seem as if the grave hadn't been disturbed in the slightest. After the deed was done, Natsume looked at Izuku, who stared at her grave one last time, taking a deep breath and exhaling. You want answers, right? Yeah, I do. What happened to you? I'm going off on a limb here, and assuming you killed that hero? Natsume asked, morbid curiosity in her tone of voice as Izuku frowned. That monster wasn't a hero. He was a sex offender, masquerading as one. He had a license, and he did save people, but he was no hero. And never would be. Not properly, anyway. He was a predator, using his power and influence to solicit minors for sex. I killed him on behalf of all of his victims. And you ate him because of what you are now, Izuku said, before looking over to her, his crimson-red eyes flaring in the darkness. What am I then? I mean, am I a zombie? That'd be cool. Natsume said as she rose her arms up like that of a generic, cartoonish zombie would, and meandered her way over to Izuku, moaning brains in a low, cartoony tone of voice, sticking her tongue out to add to the whole act. It made Izuku smirk, before he shrugged, snickering as Natsume smiled, putting her arms back down and dropping the act. Technically, if you want to chalk it up to that. But being a zombie implies you have no proper intelligence. No. What you are, and what I am, is that we are demons. Think of a fusion between vampires and onis, but, well, real and, well, what we are, Izuku began, before reaching a hand out to her. Come. Tomorrow, if you so choose, we'll go see your parents. But seeing as it's nighttime, how about I introduce you to my new friends? Besides, you'll get more answers there, because I don't think discussing this in public is a good idea. There was a small part of her that hesitated. But, then again, having access to a mirror to see what she looked like after so long was tempting. And, well, she desperately needed a shower. She probably reeked and, well, smelt like a rotting corpse. So, she took Izuku's hand, and off they went. Yushiro exited Mizudafu City Hospital with his sword sheathed to his waist and his Hiyori blowing in the cold night wind. He was right, and unfortunately, his worst fears were coming true. There was a new Demon King, and a new Demon King meant that more innocent people were going to be torn apart and devoured for the monstrous race, his monstrous race, to sustain themselves. What was worse was that, if his theory was correct about there being a new Demon King were to be true, then that meant that this Demon King was created with the immunity to sunlight, seeing as their MO as the hero cannibal showed that they stayed out during the day, and feasted upon the flesh of those who they deemed to be fakes. Yushiro couldn't lie to himself. If the rumors surrounding those heroes were true, then perhaps this Demon King was doing humanity a service. And while his base carnal instincts told him that it was treasonous to try and kill one of his kin, he knew damn well that it didn't matter to the other demons who were innocent and who weren't. He also knew that, even if he had mastered sun breathing, which he hadn't, no one other than the Kamidu or Tsujikuni bloodline could, even with the breathing styles he had mastered, with perhaps the exception of perhaps insect breathing with its use of wisteria poison, he stood no chance against the second coming of Muzan Kibutsuji. It was why he had recruited the likes of Stain, aka Akaguro Kaizome, the only remaining descendant of Ju Tomioka. With a quirk like Blood Curdle, it would help immensely. The only issue is that using such a quirk while demon slaying ran the risk of the person turning into a demon. But the short-term paralysis that it gave made it easier to decapitate demons if they fell under the clutches of said quirk. If only he used it for good, rather than evil. Yushiro sighed, looking up at the starry night sky. A frown formed on his face as he thought about his next move. He hoped that the demon he killed and the demon he saw in the house were the only two demons that had been created. Because if there were more, then disaster could already be being spelt. If enough demons were created, it could drive Japan back into a post-technology era, given enough time, that is. Walking away from the hospital's entrance, Yushiro crossed his arms as he continued to think about what to do. There were still a few people he could contact. But he knew that it would be risky. Perhaps he'd save them for later. For one thing, he didn't want to drag that boy he had just rescued into this mess. He hoped that the boy wouldn't seek him out, but the chances of him doing so were far higher than him not. So, he was going to have to prepare for a potential guest. The next thing he was going to have to do was inform Netsu of UA Academy and the other headmasters of the academies around Japan. Unlike the police, they knew about Muzan Kibutsuji. They knew the danger he represented in the past. If he told them that there was a potential for his second coming to be just as powerful as the previous one was, he'd hoped that they would act upon it with seriousness. In fact, he had heard the name tossed around by a few schoolgirls walking by his shop one day. They mentioned how a new kid, named Muzan Kibutsuji, had just started attending their school. He apparently worked at the local McDonald's. If that was true, if it truly is him, he'd recognize me instantly. Still, I have to confront them. I need to know whether or not this was a coincidence, or if it is the real deal. I know I have no hope of killing him, no one truly does. Not unless they can destroy every cell of his body in one single strike. But if I can at least see if he is the monster who he was in his past life, or if he isn't, then perhaps, maybe, just maybe, my fear is unfounded. Yushiro uncrossed his arms and stared at the entrance of his shop. He knew his wishes and prayers were probably him hoping for the reality of the situation to not be the case. He knew damn well that any demon king would be just as vicious, if not more so, than Muzan Kibutsuji. And if this Muzan Kibutsuji was the same as the previous one, what with him creating demons, he knew that he had his work cut out for him. Right now, Kaizome was off doing his own thing. He wasn't going to stop him. What he did in his pastime was what he did in his pastime. If it meant killing fake heroes, or, well, fake heroes, he'd let him do it. So long as innocent civilians stayed out of his line of sight. Entering his home, which doubled as his place of business, Yushiro closed the door behind him and approached his laptop, one of the only things he liked about this new era of technological advancement, opened up his email, and began to type out a message to every headmaster of Japan's top 3 hero schools, UA, Ketsubutsu High School, and Shiketsu Academy. With the new year coming around, and with entrance exams just opening for people to sign up to take them, he hoped that contacting them now wasn't too late. He needed to warn the new generation of heroes of just how deadly demons were. Otherwise, their deaths would be swift, and the future would be lost. Should his conversation with this new Muzan Kibutsuji go wrong, he'd have no choice but to start up the Demon Slayer Corp once again. With or without the Obuyashiki family being around anymore. A man shrouded in darkness hummed to himself as a variety of medical equipment stared, watching the news. Yet another was found eaten to the bone, and yet another pest out of his and his successor's way. When he first heard of the man-eating hero cannibal, he thought they'd be caught and weeded out within the coming months. But when they persisted for almost 4 years, they caught his attention. With both the hero killer running amok, causing chaos for hero society, and this new wannabe hero killer who ate his foes rather than simply killing them, he had to say that he was intrigued by his presence. He wondered, would it be possible to get such a villain into the fold? What would it cost him? What was their quirk? Who were they, exactly? How could they blackmail them into joining the League of Villains? Tamura Shigaraki was going to need some underlings, or perhaps an equal partner to run the clan. As much as he put faith in Tamura, he knew that he couldn't do it in his current state, and with his current power. He was too immature, too rash. For as much as Dr. Daruma Garaki told him this, he still believed in Tamura, far more than he believed in whoever the doctor had picked or suggested. Kachisaki, his first option, hated the idea of quirks, despite having quite the powerful one of his own. His second option, Tuya Todoroki, burnt down the entire orphanage the doctor had been running for farming quirks and ran away. His quirk was too powerful for his body, anyway, so he wasn't an option either, seeing as he was probably going to drop dead in the next 4 months, at least, that had been the thought at the time. Interestingly, after a decade, he reappeared again as Dabi. So perhaps he had been wrong about the young man? Whatever the case might have been, Tamura Shigaraki, a.k.a. Tenko Shimura, was his best bet as his successor. Not only was it ironic, but he had the right amount of hatred and the right amount of power to become his next vessel. Not that Tamura knew that was the case, but he didn't need to know in the first place. However, as previously mentioned, he was too immature at the moment. And while his body wasn't going to die on him too soon, he was still growing weak, and his longevity quirks were slowly becoming obsolete. If he didn't turn Tamura into a new vessel in the coming decade, he was going to die, and along with him, his entire empire. He needed to speed up Tamura's mental maturity. So, he hoped that this hero cannibal person would be the perfect fit for someone to help the man-child grow. For as much as he respected Kurojiri, he was a high-end Nomu first, and a person last. He would listen to every command Tamura would give him, and not question him even for a moment, unless the idea was truly stupid. But, if someone, who he was betting on being a sane individual rather than a maniac as the news was trying to assert, were to help Tamura grow into his own, and be powerful enough to not be scared by Tamura's decay and threats, then perhaps he could get Tamura to grow out of his man-child phase, and grow into a proper adult. And then, once he accomplished that, he'd have Dr. Garaki begin the metamorphosis phase, and Tamura Shigaraki's body would be his. All for One smiled. Kurojiri, the ancient human said, as a pair of glowing yellow eyes appeared in the darkness. The gaseous humanoid wearing a black waistcoat, white shirt, light green pants and black shoes took full form before All for One, before bowing. Yes, Master. What is it that you require of me? Kurojiri asked as All for One's expression turned serious, the smile vanishing as he spoke. Identify, and bring me the hero cannibal. Use whatever methods you need. I wish to meet the person behind the title. I believe he can help in Tamura's growth as a person, and as a villain. Don't you agree, Doctor? All for One asked, as a man with gear-like glasses, covered in shadow, huffed. That cannibalistic brute? Depending on who he is, and depending if he's all there in the head, there's a chance, but I wouldn't assume anything, All for One. He could be unstable, just like Shigaraki. That would create an echo chamber of stupidity if you ask me, Dr. Garaki replied as All for One hummed. Perhaps, but I am a betting man. And all bets go toward that I'm right. If he does not agree, I will simply steal his quirk and have him turned into a Nomu. That way, we both benefit from this. Right, Doctor? All for One asked, to which Dr. Garaki laughed. Yes. Oh, you are truly a genius, Master. I cannot wait. And with that, Dr. Garaki disappeared. Kurojiri did as he was told, and All for One was left in silence, his smile returning. The future was looking grim, and he loved it. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe.